Hi, folks. Welcome. My name is Mike Wilson. I am the Executive Director of AIA East Bay. This is the sponsored event by PAE and Lowney Architects. They are a fantastic sponsor for AIA East Bay at the platinum level, which means you can't get any higher because they're at the top. The other thing I want to say about them, besides thanking them for letting us use their space, is we want to hold as many meetings, live meetings, and as many offices as possible. An example today, here in Lowney, you get a chance to see what their culture is, kinds of projects they work on, how exciting it is to work here, and just get a vibe for what's out there and what the possibilities are. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Mark here.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
And I'll be brief. I just want to thank you all for coming tonight. I see a lot of my colleagues are here tonight, but also Lowney Architecture, we're very pleased to sponsor this series. And part of it is that this is an area of practice that we are all increasingly going to need to be knowledgeable about. And the information is out there. How do we decarbonize our environment? And that's really the main event. So we have a 4-part series. If you haven't signed up for the other 3, here's your chance. And over the course of the year, if you take all 4 courses, you will have met your zero net carbon requirement for continuing education credits. And I don't know about you, but that is a release. That's like a real relief to me to know that I can take care of it. Now, it is knowledge that we need to practice, and I think that's part of what we're trying to do with this series. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Alper Erten from PAE Engineers, and he's going to help us with that journey.
Right.
All right, thank you.
Can people see me when I stand up? I'm usually used to standing up now because hopefully, yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. My name is Alper Erten, and I work for PAE Engineers. My background is in mechanical engineering. I've been running our regenerative design group at PAE. So I do a lot of energy modeling, code compliance calculations, and net zero buildings, or electric design, anything that's related to building performance analysis. I am in charge of that. So yeah, as Mike and Mark mentioned, we have a 4-session session for this year, focusing on decarbonization and net zero buildings. This is the first one. Today we'll be focusing on the energy code updates, and I'll get a little bit into electrification and similar regulations, and then we'll have these 4 or 3 additional sessions upcoming throughout the year. So for today's session, learning objectives, you have them as an AIA requirement, so we'll be identifying major areas of change in the new California Title-24 energy code. I'm talking about the California city reach codes in addition to the state code, and we'll learn about how to estimate the code required PV and battery capacity for all new buildings, and then we'll become familiar with the electrification technologies and impact on the building electrical service requirements for the buildings. And the presentation itself will start with code trends background. I'll give you a summary of the California city reach codes, and then we'll dive into the new state energy code. And after that, we'll be touching on the electrification building technologies and the impact on the electrical service. And then we'll end with the question Q&A session at the end. So yeah, I have multiple sections. I mean, if we can, have questions at the end of each section, if that's preferred, or I can do it at the very end. So we'll have plenty of time available for that. So why decarbonize? As you most likely have heard of, we have the climate change happening currently, and we need to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees to avoid significant impacts on climate. And to achieve this goal, the developed countries need to go to 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions in terms of where they were by 1990. And if you're following the articles, there have been some, recent articles from Bill Gates that this goal is likely not achievable anymore, but we'll try to get as close as possible to it to minimize the climate impacts. So this is the U.S. greenhouse gas emission reduction roadmap. There are two major pieces. We have the transportation and industrial carbon emissions, and then we have the buildings at the bottom, which are shown in orange. And the plan for the U.S. is to go down to 100 megametric tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year by the year 2050. Currently, we're sitting around, but we were at 2,000 at 1990. So this is what it means by going down. And we have a way to go. So there is a California legislation to help with reaching this goal. So a Senate bill has passed in 2018. This is about where all residential buildings, for that, as per that bill, all residential buildings, the new ones, would need to be net zero by 2020. So we're there for single family housing. That's the code right now. And then all commercial buildings would need to be net zero by 2030, and that includes higher residential as well. So that's the bill, the main bill. We also have some recent bills and proposals being passed in the state. One of them is the California Air Resources Board ban on gas furnaces and water heaters. So this recently passed in 2022, and it's going to be finalized by 2025. But once it's finalized, it's going to ban sales of gas furnaces and water heaters for any reason. So even if your, gas heater breaks in your house, you won't be able to replace it with another gas heater. You will have to replace it with an electric heater. So that's a major step in decarbonizing the state. And then there's also another bill at the bottom that's about refrigerants, because refrigerant leakage is also a big contributor to ozone depletion and climate change effects. So we are also phasing out the refrigerants step by step, and most widely used or today's refrigerants will be banned by 2035 and will be replaced by more natural refrigerants like CO2. So as a part of that 2018 bill, the plan is to completely decarbonize the grid in California. So it's currently happening, and that will happen by adding more solar and wind power into the grid mix. So yeah, the grid is getting cleaner and cleaner each year. So that's currently happening. And then at the building level for decarbonization, how we get there. So you have a typical building that has a gas energy use and electricity energy use right now. And the first step is to reduce demand by improving building envelope, putting more efficient systems, educating the users or the occupants, so you reduce your demand. The second step will be to electrify buildings, because there's no other way of, you have to get rid of gas use if we want to get to net zero carbon. So yeah, this is about the second step is electrification of the system, which is currently happening through city reach codes, which I'll get into a little bit. And the last step is the decarbonization of the grid, which is done by the state right now. So we don't really have to do anything about that. But yeah, basically by making our buildings all electric design, you will be helping in the achievement of the net zero goal. So in addition to the grid becoming cleaner, just getting back to other emissions that impact the climate. So in the pie chart here, you're seeing like the annual carbon equivalent emissions that impact the atmosphere. 76% of it is carbon dioxide, and then we get 16% of the emissions from methane. And this is the CO2 equivalent impact of each emission type, and we have nitrous oxide from industrial emissions, and then we have fluorinated gases. That's refrigerants and other similar, again, industrial use gases. So out of those, just getting back to the electrification. So natural gas, you burn natural gas, you get CO2 emissions. We all know that, but not the main component of natural gas is methane, which is like 96% of natural gas is methane, and you have other fluorocarbons or hydrocarbons in that mix. But so methane, when it leaks, it actually has 25 times more global warming potential compared to CO2. So a little bit of methane leakage can result in more significant impact on the climate. And that's for the 100-year global warming potential that's being, that has been used widely up to now. And then now there's another metric, which is 20-year global warming potential. So it's the impact within the next 20 years, since we don't have that much time to decarbonize, we have to do this in the next 20 years, right? So now we're looking at that. And then when you look at that time period, methane's impact is actually 84 times compared to the CO2. So yeah, methane leakage matters. And then here is like kind of like a statement from an author on the topic, the expert on the topic, which says, yeah, if you have around 3% leakage of natural gas at the production site, transmission, or in processing, it's actually equal to burning coal in terms of the impact on the atmosphere. So natural gas has been marketed as, environmental friendly and clean up to now, but it's not as environmental friendly if you take into account all these impacts. And the EPA, US EPA report lists the average methane leakage from the natural gas industry to be around 1.2%. So it's not as bad as 3%, but we still, get some leakage. So that has an impact on the atmosphere in addition to the actual burning the gas. So another other regulations on electrification. So we have, as you know, especially in the Bay Area, we have a lot of cities that have REACH codes. And these REACH codes are about electrification of building systems. And these REACH codes basically require most new buildings to be all electric on the system side. And some also require adding PV arrays, and then also providing EV charging stations in the buildings. And the current code also requires PV installation and EV charging requirements as well, but in about half of the cities, it actually exceeds the code requirement, so it's above the code requirement. So and then we have natural gas bans in many cities, and then some cities allow the use of gas for commercial kitchens or labs in some cases, other cities don't. So there are a lot of slight differences between the REACH codes. So there's like this is a list from last year actually, and it's been constantly changing. For instance, LA just published their all electric REACH code in December, is effective now in January. So every month now a new city is joining the crowd. And the best resource is this website, Local Energy Code. So if you go here, that gives you a full list of the latest requirements in each city in California, and then details, and you can download the ordinances for further details. So I highly recommend it. It's very useful. So that's about the REACH codes. And I'll keep mentioning REACH codes because you'll find out the state energy code is getting more stringent, but it doesn't require all electric design for commercial and multifamily buildings yet. So when you're in a city that has a REACH code, then the REACH code becomes more stringent or more limiting in terms of electrification requirements or EV charging or PV requirements. And with that, I am going to talk about the state energy code next. So the building energy code in California is called Title-24. That's the energy code for buildings. and it's updated every 3 years. And usually the date of the code, in this case, the latest one is 2022. That means the code was written in 2022, but usually becomes effective the next year. So now we're in January 2023, which is the effective date for the code. So most new permit applications will need to comply with this code unless you had the site permit issued already last year, so you can get grandfathered in to the old code, but otherwise you're going to have to comply with this new code. And this is like a summary of changes. So one big change is the used to be separate sections for low-rise multifamily and high-rise multifamily buildings in the code before. Now they're all combined into a single chapter, which is called multifamily. So it has like 3 major sections. You have the multifamily, you have single-family residential portion, and then you have the commercial. Today I'll be focusing more on the multifamily and commercial. And as I mentioned, the city reach codes will continue to dictate the more stringent design requirements, because Title-24, the 2022 version of the code, does not require the building systems to be all electric. There is a law that was passed several years ago in the Senate, and that basically prevents the CEC, which is California Energy Commission, the organization that comes up with all the energy codes. So it limits CEC's ability to promote any fuel that is not economically viable, which means like right now, gas in California, the unit energy price for unit energy of gas is around like a quarter of electricity. So gas is still cheaper if you're used for heating in your buildings, in most cases. So because of that, the code cannot ban gas use at the state level, but the cities don't have that block. So that's why we're seeing all these individual city codes in California. Eventually, the whole state will go electric, but right now that's not the case. And yeah, when you're doing the code compliance analysis, the bayside building still uses gas for heating in the compliance models. And the software is updated frequently during the early days of a new code cycle, which is what we're in right now. The state takes its time to fix the compliance software. So if you talk to your design engineers, you might hear certain things like, oh, we're having issues, modeling certain system types, mostly electric system types. So we're still using workarounds around those. The software is still getting updated. And yeah, the electric system compliance is still challenging, even though the cities require it. The state still uses gas as the baseline. So when you have an electric building, there are a few challenges for code compliance. We have significant changes in the new code in terms of the PV and battery requirements, which I'll spend a bit more time on that. And then we have some minor changes on the envelope, lighting system, lighting electrical, and HVAC systems. I will briefly touch on these as well. So continuing the summary, the PV and battery requirements apply to new construction only. So if your project is existing or a minor renovation, you don't have to worry about that. It's a prescriptive requirement, which means technically or in theory, you could offset the lack of PV in your building with your energy efficiency measures, but practically it's very hard to do it. So in most projects, if the code requires you to provide PV and battery in your buildings, you'll have to provide it for compliance for large scale buildings. Battery requirements only applies to multifamily with 4 or more habitable stories. So if you're a low-rise multifamily, you don't need to put batteries, but you still have the PV requirements. And this PV and battery system requirements, they result in significant cost increase in project budgets, or there are some alternative methods which shifts the cost, utility cost to future utility bill. I'll give you some examples, example calculations, so you can see the self impact. So the alternative of providing PV battery on site is to participate in a CEC approved community solar program for a minimum of 20 years. And what does that mean? It's like what's a CEC approved community solar program means? It's a bit unclear right now. They give the SMUDS, which is the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. They have a CEC compliant community solar program. I mean, we have a lot of what you call it, like the Silicon Valley clean energy, collabs or co-ops. So we have those. So most likely their solar programs will be compliant, but it's not super clear right now. The exception is if you have a project with multi-tenant build it, about 10 units, and if the local utility doesn't provide virtual net metering or a community solar program is not available, then you don't have to comply with these. But in California, I think most utility companies, they do have virtual net metering capabilities. So it would be a very small exception. Or if your building roof is getting less than 70% annual solar access, which means that if you're not getting, if you have like surrounding taller buildings around your building, and if your roof is going to be shaded for more than 30% of the year, then you don't have to provide PV. And there's some other exceptions as well. So performance-based compliance. This is when the energy code has prescriptive requirements in it, which I'll get into in a minute. It requires to install certain systems with certain efficiencies, minimum efficiencies, or your envelope, needs to have certain insulation values, R values, U values, or your glazing needs to be 30% or less. And like that, those are the prescriptive requirements. And if you don't want to deal with performance calculations, that's the path you follow. You design your building that way. It's kind of like a straightforward code compliance. But most projects that we see don't follow this path. We usually want more flexibility in our design. You want more flexibility on the building envelope. You may want to provide more glazing. So in those cases, usually the projects pick the performance compliance approach, and that's when you follow this path, basically performance-based compliance. That's when you build energy models for your buildings and compare it against Title-24 baseline. And if your proposed building model is showing less energy use than your baseline, then you're good to comply. So yeah, for performance-based compliance, the baseline still consists of gas-fired equipment, as I mentioned, because that's the baseline for multifamily and commercial buildings in California right now. We will have the same challenges in code compliance for electric systems, because the software is kind of a little bit late, but hopefully we'll get there. The electric heating equipment will continue to cause performance penalty in Title-24 models. That's the energy code compliance model, which is the case right now, unfortunately. And yeah, compliance software is frequently revised. So the performance compliance approach used to use a metric called TDV, which is time dependent value of energy. It's kind of like time of use tariff for your electricity bill or gas. So it's not just the amount of energy, but when you use it is also important. If you're using electricity in midsummer during a hot day, that has a more impact on the grid. Therefore, the rate price rate for it is also higher. So TDV is kind of mimicking that. That was the only metric used before for code compliance. Now it also includes source energy, which is basically the source field that you use for your energy, like for electricity. If you have gas power plants in the state, which we still do, it takes into account the gas burned at the plant level, not just the electricity that you use. Just kind of like a more holistic energy picture. So next, I'm going to PV and battery systems. How is it going in terms of I'm going fast and there's a lot of technical information here. If you have any questions, I'll do a quick stop before getting to the next section. Are you good? Just go ahead and continue until the
Yeah,
end.
people online can put their questions in chat.
Yeah. Please put your questions in chat and I'll get to them at the end of the presentation. All right, next we are going to the PV and value system requirements. So the PV and value, we'll start with the PV system requirements. So the energy code has different climate zones. I'm just gonna jump into another slide just to show you the map, and I'll go back. So the map you see on the left side for me is the California climate zone map. The energy code splits the regions in terms of temperatures observed in those areas into different climate zones, and then they're numbered, and then the requirements for different climate zones are different. And in the map you're seeing the most of the area, including Oakland, San Francisco, Monterey, the areas that are closer to the coast. They're under climate zone 3, which is like mild climate. And as you go more inland, like Moline Creek, Sacramento, those are climate zone 12 in the Bay Area, which is like the warmer part of the area. And we also have climate zone 1 and 2 up north. And then the Southern California, you have more subzones in Southern California. So it's climate zone 8, 9, and 16. That's like the Los Angeles area. And as you go more inland in Los Angeles, it becomes a different climate zone. So there's a table in the energy code, which is the table you see on the right corner. So we have different factors for different climate zones with different numbers. The sunnier your climate zone is, the warmer. You will see there, because PV is even more advantageous in those areas, you'll see their PV requirement is actually slightly larger compared to the more cloudy climate zones like San Francisco. I'm going to go back, sorry. So that's the table. So there are the way to calculate the PV requirement for new construction. There are two formulas. One is based on, and there are two formulas. You use both formulas and you take the minimum of the two, and that's your PV requirement. So the first formula is you look at the factor. So let's say we have a retail building in Oakland, right? So that's climate zone 3, the first column of the table. And then you look at retail, so the factor A for that project would be 2.62. And then you multiply with your floor area, and then you come up with a number, and that's in kilowatts or watts of PV capacity. The second formula is based on the net roof area available on your project. So you take your net roof area and multiply it by 14, and then again you come up with another number in watts, and that's also PV capacity. You take the minimum of the two, and that's your PV requirement. I'll show you an example. In terms of this net roof area for multi-story buildings, usually the second formula will give you the lower number, and that will be your requirement for the code. Mainly because in multi-story buildings, you're going to have mechanical equipment on top, or electrical or HVAC equipment. So that's going to take some space. You can subtract that space from your net roof area in the calculation. If you have occupied roof area like terraces, you can also subtract that. So you don't have to take that into account. And if your roof, the areas of your roof that are shaded by the surrounding buildings, or even by the same architectural elements of the building, like louvers or anything similar, and pop-ups, casting shade, you can subtract those areas as well. And then after you calculate the PV capacity, we look at the second table for battery capacity calculations. This is solely based on the building type. So you, based on your building type, you pick a factor for your building and then you multiply the PV capacity previously calculated with this factor, and then you come up with your battery size, and it'll make more sense when we do an example. So here's an example. I picked a 8-story multifamily housing building in climate zone 3. I mean, I just picked Monterey for this example, but yeah, Oakland and San Francisco are also in climate zone 3. So it'll be the same. So this building has a 128,000 square feet floor area. It's 8 stories, and I assume it would be just like a, boxy or rectangular prison building with a uniform floor area per floor. So that gives me 15,000 square foot of footprint for the building. And then I assumed 40% of that, like that would be your roof area or your footprint. And I assume 40% of that area would be available. The rest would be taken up by, equipment or any other systems on the roof. So yeah, typically that's like a rough assumption. So that gives me 6,000 square foot of net roof area for this building. Again, like as your buildings get taller and taller, if you have like a 15-story or 10-story tall building, probably you're not going to have to install any PV because all your roof is going to be taken up by the equipment. In that case, you probably will not have to install the PV. For mid-rise buildings, you still have to do it depending on your design. So again, for this building, we started calculating the PV requirement using both formulas. So the first one was the floor area times factor A. For this building, since the multi-family buildings, the factor is 1.82 multiplied by the floor area, we come up with a PV capacity of 218 kW. If it's and then the next step is to calculate based on the roof area, which is 6,000 we decided for the net roof area. Multiplied by 14, it comes down to 84 kW for the PV capacity. So out of the two numbers, 84 is the lower. So that's our PV requirement, code required PV capacity. And then this is an old example, just to see like what's the cost impact for this. I had used $3.5 per watt for the PV price. It's going up right now with all the the inflation and supply chain issues and all that stuff. So it's more likely to be around $4.5 probably right now. But yeah, just to give you a number. So for this assumption, it ends up being around $300,000 cost to the project from the PV. So that's the state code requirements. I wanted to remind that in addition to state code, we also have city reach codes, which are listed here. So most cities are similar or less than the state required PV, like example, Berkeley, Palo Alto, San Francisco require 15% of your roof area to have PV. But there are a few exceptions, like the Mountain View. City of Mountain View requires 50% of your roof area to be covered in PV. So that's likely to be higher than what we calculated here. So again, check your city reach code for additional requirements. Don't just stick to the state code. So after we calculate the PV capacity, which is 84 kW, we move on to calculation of battery system for the building. So yeah, we take the 84 kW PV capacity and multiply by the appropriate factor, which is 1.03 for high-rise multifamily. And then, I mean, the 0.93 you see there is like a typical battery discharge coefficient, so technical performance spec for batteries. You don't have to worry too much about that. So overall, this results in 100 kWh battery capacity. And the cost, again, ranges anywhere between $1,000 to $1,500 per kWh of batteries. Initially we were hoping that the cost would go down further, but batteries are becoming more widely used, which hopefully will be the case when the code requires it. So hopefully the price will go down with more manufacturers or more mass production. But right now, yeah, $1,000 per kWh of battery capacity is the the price that I'm using, and for 100 kWh battery capacity, that ends up being $100,000 for that battery, which is the required by state. So that would be a total of $400,000 impact on your building for this size. If it was a shorter building, like it was 6 stories instead of 8 stories, and where you would have a larger roof area, potentially your PV and battery requirement would be slightly larger than this, what you calculate. And then taller building is the opposite. For taller, you have less and less requirement. So the alternative is, if you don't want to do this, because it's a lot of cost, you can participate in a CEC approved community solar share program. It's kind of like a utility service. So you probably will end up paying higher rates for your electricity use because you're getting it from 100% renewable energy sources. But you don't have to install anything at day one. So you're kind of shipping the cost. The PPAs for solar, they're accepted. You don't have to necessarily own it. The owner doesn't have to own the PV system, as long as it's a part of the building design, and as long as it will be installed at day one. So you can't just defer it to future. It has to be installed at day one of your building. And then the community solar program, I guess it's the next slide. So it needs to be operational during the processing of your permit. So you can't say like, oh, I'll participate in the future, or I'll participate in a future program. It has to be available when the permit is being issued. So yeah, that's an alternative. It has to be approved by CEC, has to be operational at the time of permit. And yeah, must provide benefit for the project for a minimum of 20 years from its building date, construction date. So next, I'm going to talk about the building envelope requirements. So I split this into multifamily residential versus commercial, and we're starting with the multifamily resi. As I mentioned, the changes are not that major because the California Energy Code was already quite stringent in terms of insulation requirements. There are some like slight changes, and it really differs based on the climate. The hotter climates or the very cold climates, which we don't have many in California, but we still have some regions. You have a bit more stringent requirements in those harsher climates, and then less so in the milder coastal zones. Yeah, I think I would talk about the climate zones here. These are just some examples. And then for these climate zones, like 3, 4, 12, just like most of where we see the projects. The wall insulation requirements has gone from 0.069 U value to 0.059. What does that mean? So for a metal framed wall, you would have to have a 2 inches thick of insulation layer, continuous insulation layer, in addition to that insulation. Now that continuous insulation layer needs to be another 0.6 inches thicker than before to get to this lower U value. That's an additional R2.5 insulation. And you're seeing that this is new also, the walls are now categorized in terms of fire rating. So yeah, if your wall is above 1 hour fire rating, then the U value requirement is slightly less stringent compared to less fire rated walls. So that's kind of new in the code. And then yeah, when you have less fire rating, you need more insulation. So it's another 1.2 inches continuous insulation layer in your walls. One thing new about the code, you need to install a radiant barrier on the roof for residential buildings. That wasn't the mandatory code requirement before, and that was good practice. So now it's a prescriptive code requirement. If you don't install it, then you have to make up for it in other ways, like adding more insulation on the roof, or adding more insulation on your walls, or putting better windows and stuff like that. So the glazing, again, for multifamily residential, Hasn't been any big changes there. It used to be 40% glazing cap for the prescriptive path. It's still 40%. But the windows, the type of windows that you can install have changed a little bit. So for most climate zones, the code required SHGC, which is the solar heat gain coefficient of your glass. It used to be 0.25, now it's 0.23. When these numbers go lower, it means it becomes more insulating or darker. Your glass will look darker. So for reference, SolarVent 70XL is very popular in California for commercial or high-rise projects, for instance. And that has an SHGC of 0.27. You know, it was already slightly above the code value, but it wasn't that far away. So, you know, in most projects, we were seeing that glass type. Now we will probably see SolarVent 90, which is like a similar product, but slightly darker. So we'll probably see that being used more often because it's closer to the new code required SHGC value 0.23. Otherwise, you have to make up for it by adding external shades or any other similar measures. So there, I mean, they introduced new certification, NAFS, North American Fenestration Standard. So that's like a special label window product. If you use those products, then it gives you a little bit of extra buffer in performance rating. So instead of 0.23, can do up to 0.24, and the U value for the window goes up from 0.3 to 0.4 because I think they're trusting the standardization for NAFS more. So they're allowing you to use higher values. Curtain walls, there are any significant changes for curtain walls. It will be the same in most climate zones except 14 and 16. Those are the very inland zone that we can see on the map, 16 and 14. In other areas, it's the same for curtain wall, no changes there for performance specs. For non-residential, for office or similar commercial buildings, again, minor changes in the Bay Area. External wall insulation, there's slight changes in external wall insulation values, and they're slightly different depending on your climate zone. And one big change is the air barrier requirements. So this wasn't required before prescriptively, air barriers. Now they are required. And if you don't include air barriers in your buildings, then it results in a performance penalty if you're doing performance based compliance. So you have to make up for it by other means. And if you're following a prescriptive path, then you have to install air barriers on your external walls. So that's new. Some examples there, these are the tables. I'm just showing, going through what I just mentioned, then different climate zones at the top. 1 to 16 requires slightly different numbers, but for the most, for the walls, for instance, the same values with some exceptions. And then glazing for non-residential buildings. So there aren't any changes on the SHGC values for the Bay Area, climate zones 3 and 4. They are very similar to what they used to be, which is 0.36 and 0.25. And then again, curtain wall is also it's the same as before. But in warmer climates like downtown Los Angeles area or Sacramento, which is climate zone 9 or 12, the SHGC of the windows need to be lower at 0.22. And curtain walls are unaffected. So that's the summary of the envelope. And then, yeah, similar to the walls, like you have more detailed tables and the colors provided, in case anyone was curious. Different climate zones require slightly different window performance specs. So I'll do a very brief touch on building systems. I'm not going to get too much into detail. You can always ask your engineers for details during your building design process. But in summary, the efficiency requirements for the equipment have increased. So like, we have to buy higher efficiency equipment. And so for multi-family buildings now, the prescriptive system type is heat pump serving each unit. And all other system options require performance-based compliance path. So if you want to use a gas boiler, if you're in a city that doesn't have that REACH code, and the owner says, no, I want to stick with gas boiler for my building, then you would have to do some performance calculation because the prescriptive system type is heat pump. For gas boilers and domestic hot water heaters, if you install them, the minimum thermal efficiency is now 90% thermal efficiency. And that means the equipment needs to be condensing type to get to that efficiency. You can't get to that efficiency without like non-condensing equipment or gas fired equipment. And yeah, as I mentioned, like even if you're in a city that still allows you to use gas in your design, you still have to provide additional electric capacity in your building so that in the future the owner can swap the gas-fired systems with the electric system. So you still have to provide that additional electric capacity. Economizers are required for systems that have a cooling capacity of 3 tons or like close to 3 tons. So what does that mean? This mainly impacts the TI projects, or it has some impact on the multifamily projects as well. So what we were seeing, for instance, you have old buildings, for instance, VRF is a very popular system type, or you can put split systems sometimes when you're renovating old buildings. And that was okay in the past. Now, if you have those systems that the capacity of each equipment is greater than 3 tons, then you have to provide either an economizer or a dedicated outdoor air supply to those zones with economizer capability. So it made it a bit more complicated. Another example is multi-family residential buildings. So this requirement doesn't apply to dwelling units like apartments in the building, but for the common areas in your like large multifamily buildings, if you have common areas like lounges and similar areas, you would again put like a split heat pump or like VRF system serving those areas, and that you would be fine. Now, if you had that system is about 3 ton capacity, you have to provide either dedicated outdoor air system again, or you have to like have like super high COP. That's like the efficiency of the system. So super high efficient system there if you don't provide any economizer or dedicated outdoor air supply to those zones. And 3 tons is not a very big capacity. So if you have like this space, for instance, would meet 3 tons easily. Not going to get too much into detail, but just know that like this economizer requirement is more stringent in the new code, and for dedicated outdoor air systems, you might need heat recovery now. You didn't really need heat recovery modules in the Bay Area before because the climate is mild, but in some cases now you might need it, and that's just additional cost to the system, but it improves the efficiency. For domestic hot water heating, for the REACH codes, like if you have a REACH code, because your city has it, then heat pump is the common or the required system type for domestic hot water heating. And you don't need any additional solar requirements when you use that air source heat pump to provide domestic hot water heating, besides what's required by the code. You have the option to use gas if you're in a city that doesn't have that electric REACH code. Again, that equipment needs to be 90% efficiency, which needs to be condensing boiler. And on top of that, you have to provide additional solar capacity with your heater. So in addition to what the code requires, you have to add additional solar, either solar thermal heater. Actually, it has to be solar thermal, there used to be a PV equivalent requirement option for electric, but for gas, you don't have that. So it requires even more solar. moving on to lighting next time, so lighting power has gone down in the new code for certain space types. You're seeing the older code 2019 versus for an office building, you're at 0.65 watts per square foot. Now it used to be 0.6. Corridors used to be 0.6, now they aim to be 0.4. So the older code values, the LED systems, like LED lighting systems, it wasn't a big deal. You could easily meet these code requirements with LEDs. Now it became a bit more challenging. So for certain cases, I'm hearing from our lighting designers that it's more difficult to get to these lower values. So it's going to be a bit more. It's going to take a bit more thinking getting to those levels. In terms of daylight dimming, no major changes except the code required your spaces to be split into 2 daylighting zones when you have like a window like this one. So your first daylight zone would be 15 feet away from the wall or the space or distance equal to your wall height. And then the second row would be the same like length, but next to that first zone, primary zone. So previously you only required to provide daylight dimming controls for the primary daylight zone. Now you have to do both primary and secondary daylight zone. The code already had a requirement on receptacles, like certain for all new buildings, certain number of receptacles would need to be automatically controlled. And now if you have that, they also need to be demand response capable. EV charging. So EV charging is not controlled by the energy code. It's mandated by Cal Green standards instead. That's kind of the Cal Green, and you already are familiar most likely, but it's kind of like the lead equivalent of California. And then for non-residential buildings, Cal Green requirements. This is the mandatory requirements, which means you have to do it. On all buildings. So it depends on the number of parking spots you have in your buildings. If you don't have any parking spots, obviously you don't have to provide any electric vehicle charging stations. But yeah, let's say you have like 25 parking spaces in your building. That means you have to provide 4 future EV capable space. That means you have to do provide the infrastructure, electrical infrastructure, cabling and everything going to those spaces, but you don't have to actually install the charger itself. That's what EV capable space means. And then if you have more parking spaces, then there's an additional requirement, which is the EV capable EV SC. So that is basically a level 2 charger. So let's say you have 50 parking spaces, that means 8 of your spaces will need to be EV capable, and out of those 8, 2 will have to be level 2 charger capable. And again, level 1 charging means like when you plug the car into your regular home plug, that's level 1. Level 2 is when you have specific car chargers, as you see in the image. And then level 3 is superchargers, like the Tesla supercharger. So that's level 1, 2, 3. And for multifamily residential buildings, again, like unless you're doing Cal Green Tier 1 and Tier 2, you are gonna only need to comply with the mandatory provisions, which is the first column. Again, certain percentage of your parking space will need to be EV capable. And a portion would need to be level 2 capable. And then, some of them would be installed with the actual equipment, and while others only require infrastructure. For existing buildings, there's also a requirement for existing buildings if you're doing renovation. And those are slightly less. Again, you have to be 10% of your parking space need to be EV capable. If you're following the Cal Green Tier 1 and Tier 2, which is, kind of like paths, voluntary paths for projects, or the cities may require it for permit application instead of LEED requirements, then you have to have more EV chargers. So that was all the energy code. a lot of technical information again. If you have questions, please add in the chat. I'll get to those at the end of the session. Next, I'll be talking a bit about the building technologies for electrification. So we have all these city reach codes for electric design requirements, and how do we get there? So typically, you have for space heating, you have gas boilers. We are used to seeing gas-fired water heaters for domestic hot water heating, and then cooking. We often see gas ovens or stoves. So what we will be seeing more and more, we already have variable ERS systems commonly used, but also the last few years we are designing buildings with air source heat pumps as the main heating element. So these are electric equipment that basically extract the heat from the outdoor air and then puts it into your system and provides space heating using electricity. Domestic hot water heating, again, similar air source heat pumps, similar technologies, just like smaller dimensions that are specific for domestic hot water user than space heating. And in some cases, you can also use water source heat pumps. Let's say you have like ground heat exchange loop, so you can do water to water heat pumps or air. Or if you have a district center plant, you can tie into that and do some heat recovery with these equipment as well. And for cooking, we have induction cooking appliances or convection combination ovens that we are seeing, and they're becoming more and more common. The traditional gas boiler center plant for a residential building, for instance, you would have water source heat pumps at each level, and you would see cooling towers to reject that heat, and then you would have gas boilers providing heat to the system, backup heat, and then we have gas domestic water heater. In an electric system, the boilers basically are replaced by air source heat pumps. That's feeding the same system at the central level for space heating. And then you can usually have a separate air source heat pump for domestic hot water heating because the demands are different. Our engineers like to keep them separate as the baseline design usually, but in some cases then we look into combining those two together to look into like heat recovery options and additional efficiency measures. Yeah. And one thing about domestic hot water heat pumps, if you have an instantaneous water heater, it could be electric resistance or gas, you probably don't have large storage tanks. For centralized domestic hot water heating systems, if they're gas, you usually have storage tanks right now. But with heat pumps, what we're seeing is that the requirement for that storage tanks are a lot bigger now because they don't act as fast. The heat pumps don't act as fast as other system types. So that's why we see larger storage tank requirements. Other considerations about air source heat pumps. So they need to be located outside, mostly on the roof. Or if they're not outside, you have to have a lot of outdoor air access. Like they need to have circulation, full outdoor air circulation, because they extract the heat from outside or reject heat to the outside air. They're more expensive. They're heavier and larger than gas boilers. You need clearances around these equipment for airflow, outdoor airflow. Pipe sizes, you will need slightly larger pipes for these systems because the temperature difference they can provide is lower than gas systems. You will need larger electrical service capacity in your building because you're adding additional electrical equipment, which is not small. It's replacing the gas. Acoustics, they have compressors, so they will make noise. You have to take that into account. And they may cause vibration as well. So the padding will have to have some vibration isolation, similar to your chillers, basically. And lead times, yeah, there could be lead times depending on the supply chain situation. Wait could be longer for this equipment. And the controls, they're not as simple as gas systems, so it's a bit more complex. So there's a little complexity on that one as well. So all additional, challenges basically they pose, but then they're carbon free and more energy efficient. So we need them for to get to net zero carbon buildings. As an example, if you have a gas water heater, and this is a really good gas water heater, a condensing type, you're looking at a COP of 0.95, which means like 95% efficient for heating. If you go to an electric resistance heating, it could be electric resistance coil, it could be electric resistance water heater. You're looking at a COP of 1, so slightly higher efficiency compared to gas, but it's using electricity, which is expensive. If we look at air source heat pumps, they tend to have an average COP of 3 for California climate, which is 300% efficiency. So it's more than 3 times more efficient than a gas heater. And then if you're using a geothermal heat pump, then you're looking at COP of 4 or sometimes even 5. So that's like 4 to 5 times more efficient than gas heaters. And then last year's carbon emission rates per electricity and gas, like we're seeing we used to see a slight increase in electric resistance. Now they're probably more equal because the grid is getting cleaner. But yeah, in terms of carbon emissions, you have like much lower carbon emissions with the air source pump equipment compared to gas, and that's why we're seeing the switch. And then induction cooking, just roughly touching on that one. So the gas stoves, they're around 40% efficient in cooking. So like when you burn gas, only 40% of that heat is transferred to your food cooking process. The rest is rejected through your exhaust hood or it goes into the space. So they're not super efficient. When you have an electric combustion cooktop, you are actually able to transfer 70% of that energy into your food and 30% is lost to the surroundings. And if you are using an electric induction cooktop, it lists at 75% efficient, but I've seen like 80-85 in certain systems or equipment types. So it's a lot more energy efficient in delivering that heat into the food and less lost to the surroundings. So it is more energy efficient. And I'm looking at the boiler, the time it takes to boil water, like the electric systems, I guess once it's warm, it's actually quicker to cook with these. But I mean, when you first turn it on, of course, you have to wait a little bit for the electric resistance heater. So, and you might be hearing that we're getting a lot of papers, research papers on indoor air quality, and the use of gas in cooking is actually showing impacts on children's lung health, like asthma and similar issues, and eliminating gas use inside the living units is actually having a major impact on health benefits as well. It's not just energy. Last bit, the impact on electrical service capacity. So we're electrifying our buildings, great. But because we're adding more electric-based equipment, your electrical service capacity now needs to be larger than what you are used to seeing. On average, it's around 25 to 30%. Larger depending on your building program, it will change, of course. EV charging requirements can be significant. They add, again, like they have a big impact on the loads, electrical loads. Heating hot water, domestic hot water loads increase dramatically. And yeah, that your load center rates can be increased from 100 amps to 150 to 200 amps. As an example, I picked the multifamily housing project in Sunnyvale. So for that project, because of the beach code in the city of Sunnyvale, we had to, all parking spaces would have to be EV ready, 100%, which is above the code requirement that you just saw. Again, so it's a lot more stringent. And because of that, we saw a 22% increase in the household for the building because of EV charging requirement. The air source heat pumps for domestic hot water heating, so that also had an impact of 15% increase in the households compared to a gas water heater. So overall, there was a 37% electrical service capacity increase for that project. And because of that, 2 services were required. So yeah, you will see the impact. And I mean, you see it more in the, if you're trying to electrify an existing building, you will see also, electrical service capacity becomes the most limiting impact. And with that, that's the end of the presentation. So yeah, I want to have some time for questions. About 15 minutes, I think. And feel free to. So I'm just looking at checking the chat. Not seeing any questions on the chat. Okay. Do we have any questions? Yes.
Could you talk about ASHRAE versus Title-24?
Yeah. So ASHRAE 90.1 is used in the rest of the country, like with a few other, like California has its own energy code, so we don't use ASHRAE. Most states use ASHRAE 90.1 or a version of that ASHRAE 90.1 as their code compliance code, energy code. Yeah, California, Oregon, Washington, New York, Massachusetts, like there are a few states, many states actually, that have their own code, but some of the state codes are adopted versions of ASHRAE, like Oregon and Washington, for instance. So in California, you have to comply with Title-24. And in addition to that, if you, let's say if your project is LEED certified, and if you're doing like LEED energy modeling for optimized energy performance credits, then you often also follow the ASHRAE requirements as well. ASHRAE is a little less stringent than Title-24, usually, like in terms of envelope insulation and lighting, like all requirements. So typically, like if you have a Title-24 code compliant building, you automatically do 15 to 20% better than ASHRAE 90.1. So that has been the case. And ASHRAE 90.1 right now, the current versions don't require you to install PV necessarily on like or batteries, but hopefully, I mean, like likely it will get there in future updates. And what else? I mean, yeah, it's similar to Title-24, but it's less stringent ASHRAE 90.1. And it's like the software that you use to show compliance for ASHRAE is different than Title-24. And I personally like ASHRAE 90.1 better. I think it's more it's easier to comply, or it makes more sense when you want more flexibility in your design. But again, for buildings in California, you have to be the California Title-24 requirements. And then in addition to that, if your project's a LEED project, then you also need to meet ASHRAE requirements. But most of the time, a California Title-24 compliant building is automatically compliant with ASHRAE. So it's easier to comply with. One thing about that is that the 2016 update of ASHRAE, the heating system similar to California Title-24. In the past, when you had an electric building, you would have like easily get a lot of LEED points because it was really easy to show performance benefit when your building was all electric in the past. The latest version of ASHRAE is using gas heating as your baseline in California climate zone. So it's kind of similar to the Title-24 situation. It's a bit more challenging now to show compliant electric buildings against the ASHRAE baseline. Again, if your building meets Title-24, it'll meet ASHRAE easily and beat it by 10 to 20%.
I have a question there too.
Sure. How much does the second service add to the cost of construction? Good question. Unfortunately, I don't have it at the top of my head, and will depend on your local utility company, but it's not insignificant. Is the state improving the resiliency of the grid to avoid the blackouts from weather such as we had the last few weeks and the brownouts in the summer from increased electrical demand? Yes, they are. And they're doing that by installing like large scale grid scale battery units. And then part of this PV and battery requirement in every building is also is to help the grid. Because we're switching to all renewable systems, like typically when you have gas-fired or maybe nuclear power plants, they're like continuous, power plants. There's no problem in ramping them up and down, especially for gas-fired ones. And then, they are a reliable source of energy, like at any time of the day, unless you have certain issues. With renewable energy, you only have solar energy when you have sun outside. You don't have any solar production at night. With wind, again, like it can be certain times of the year, it can be continuous, but certain times you can just not have enough wind. So they're less reliable, actually. And that's why the grid, right now, like you can't have 100% renewable grid because you need some like reliable source of energy. So, I mean, batteries, if they become cheaper and common enough, we can tackle that problem with battery energy storage, which we are doing. But at some level, we will also need some other source like nuclear or they're looking into like molten salts as a different energy savings or energy storage measure. And then they're also looking into ammonia, which is a fuel that consists of nitrogen and hydrogen. So it doesn't have any carbons in it. When you burn ammonia, you get only nitrogen and water. It has some issues, so you need catalytic converters for air quality topics. But yeah, like, all those different energy storage and energy production measures are being, studied or investigated more. So yeah, I mean, definitely there's a big push on the resiliency, both at the state level, and I'm working on some project with the Department of Energy. It's definitely on their radar as well.
We got 7 years, right?
Yeah,
And they better increase by over 40% because we're increasing our buildings by 37%. So not counting the cars that are going to be charging on it by 2030, 35. So they better increase by 50% or better within the next 10 years.
yeah. I mean, it's definitely happening. Like you're seeing more and more renewable added to the PG&E or like all these other companies. They're definitely doing it. Is it going to be fast enough by 2030, 2031? We'll see about that, but that's the goal. Yeah, it's definitely like these targets are not like easily achievable.
Current.
All the more reason to put your own array on your own roof.
Like,
So-
Because your own array, you don't get to use it unless.
I'm seeing a question, since applicants should be improved before the entire state substantially increase the demand on the grid from vehicles and buildings, or we will have major problems. Why would that not be the first step or the second or the third step? It's kind of like the buildings becoming all electric is kind of incentivizing the utility companies to switch to more electric than use of gas. So it's kind of like it's basically incentivizing development of more renewable energy sources. So it's kind of like it goes together. Similar to electric cars. When you have very little electric cars, you see very little charging stations for it. But if you have enough electric cars on the roads, you're going to see more charging stations. So it kind of has to go hand in hand. So I think that's why that's the approach. Yeah, ideally, if the grid would be all clean already, that would be great. But we have to do it at the same time. We don't have a lot of time, so that's why it has to happen at the same time. But yeah, there are definitely challenges on stabilizing the grid because of the added renewable energy capacity. I'm just making sure I'm not missing anything. So everything that has been discussed increase the cost of construction, but the only factor to it is solar. What is the overall added cost by percentage to allow for the electrification of the facility? I don't know the percentage of cost, but I mean, you can look at the example, and if you know the cost of that building construction, I don't have it at the top of my head, unfortunately, but I mean, it's significant cost overall. I don't know what the overall added cost is. If anyone else knows like the typical cost per square footage, you can add that, and you can do your calculation. And I think that was it for the chat.
We have more.
Yeah, of course.
What about the PG&E amendment that's coming into effect in April? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Which one?
Something that means you should get your solar array in now before April, because the value of what you produce after.
Oh,
that,
net
you'll get
metering,
less.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's, yeah, at the utility level in the past, the state was incentivizing the installation of PVs. They want people to have, or incentivize them to have PV, so they used to have good net metering rates. So, when you have large solar PVs, sometimes you will be over generating. Like, let's say you have an office building, you have PV on the roof. During the weekends, you're not going to have anyone in the building, but you'll still be generating solar power. So with net metering, you will just export that into the grid to the utility company, and you will get a credit for it. And the current agreements is that the PG&E does one-to-one match. Like for every watt of energy you export, you get a credit for importing a watt of electricity during other times when you're using, like at nighttime, for instance. So you wouldn't have to have your on-site battery storage that way, right? And that was making PVs more economically viable. I think now it's like, okay, the PVs are not a new technology anymore. So it's kind of like, oh, you don't have to provide that incentives anymore, and then the code requires it anyway. So people will have to do it. I think that's why the state is not incentivizing as much anymore. And for the utility companies, well, yeah, if you have a lot of large PV arrays and then you have net metering, so they need to support you, right? But they are not making as much money, and they still have to support that. Like when you're not generating electricity, you still use the grid energy, and they have to provide capacity for that, and it costs them money. So because of that, they're like getting rid of this net metering, one-to-one net metering settlement or whatever you call it. But I'm not sure what the new one is exactly, but I heard that, yeah, it's not going to be one-to-one. Probably you're gonna, let's say for every watt of electricity you export, you're probably gonna get back, like let's say like 30% or half of it back in terms of the cost. So you will end up paying more to the utility company. So that's what's happening. I guess if you put your system in there, and if you have your contract signed agreement before that new amendment, then you can stay with the old net metering agreement. But yeah, I think that's what it is. It's going to be less advantageous in terms of the utility bills.
Do you think that's going to increase the demand for battery storage on site?
Potentially, yes. Potentially. And I mean, the code is requiring it already. So we have that, but it will likely make batteries more desirable. Yeah. Yeah. They're already like batteries are actually like in many projects that I did the analysis, the payback period analysis, adding batteries into a large PV array system, it actually drives down the payback period for the PV system. I mean, they're not cheap, but yeah, if you have a large enough PV array, let's say you typically see 10, 15 years of payback period for PV systems. If you add batteries to those, it goes down to like 10 years or 8 years. And because of that, most solar contractors, they actually add batteries in their codes now automatically. And if you don't ask for it, they're like, oh, here's an option for batteries, because yeah, it makes their system more desirable as well. So you will get savings with the batteries. One thing about that is like, I guess we're almost getting at the time, is that the code requirements for PV and battery systems, they don't require microgrids. So it's just about shaving peak demand at your buildings. So they will still be, getting electricity from the grid, and they're not meant to be resilience use or emergency use for the batteries. Those batteries that the state requires, they need to be used like daily to shave off your peak demand, peak electricity demand. Because the whole point is to reduce the burden on the grid to like with the fluctuations in demand with the solar generation. So yeah, if you're looking at microgrids and things like that, like the code doesn't require your system to be islanded or microgrid, but we're seeing most projects like, oh, we already have a battery and the PV in the building, so I'll just spend a bit more on my controller and then make it microgrid. So when there's a fire or like any disruption due to any natural events, then I can just have energy in my building. I don't get it through the grid, so there's that advantage. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was really good.
Thank you very much. Yeah.